The Omega raids in Final Fantasy XIV take challenge to a whole new level, and I can't wait to share with you why I think they are the most exhilarating experience thus far in the game. As a note, there are Omega spoilers throughout. You have been warned. So the Omega raids are an 8-man instance that is available after the end of the Stormblood MSQ. They follow up on the aforementioned Omega, which what we assumed was ancient Allegan technology, but as we progress through the story, we find out how untrue that is. As many have already mentioned, it is a major turning point in difficulty as far as complexity of the fights, the requirements from each individual raid member. I mean, all of these are drastically increased, and the difficulty was noted even in the trials and the dungeons in Stormblood, but man, they are so intense here in Omega. But first, let's review real quick what the Omega raids actually did really well. So as mentioned, the Omega raids are tied to the Omega weapon that we released to fight off Shinryu in the final patch of the post-Heavensward content. The Omega weapon tells a tale of a super intelligent robot that is actually not even of this world. All we know is that it was specifically built to conquer the dragon's home star, which also, by the way, just a side note, confirms that dragons are technically aliens to us too. They're not from Eorzea. This culminates into a series of tests that the Warrior of Light must do with Cid, Nero, and the bestest boy of our new friend, Alpha, to see if we can give Omega his greatest challenge yet.
Look at this dude.
Guess what? Spoiler, we were. But what's interesting in this story is that we actually start to see Omega almost have like human emotions, really questioning motives and directives, and even his own understanding of what his purpose was. Now granted, the poor robot did sail through space for several millennia or however long it was. It was a very long time, and he lost part of his own sanity, or it lost part of its sanity. So I can kind of understand that. However, Omega can't understand how the Warrior of Light, pushed into extreme peril, were able to rise up and overcome insurmountable odds. I mean, he elicited this response in us by nearly killing Biggs, Wedge, and Nero. Of course, we come out on top, and we get some interesting story elements, such as, of course, the Cid and Nero divorced energy all over the place, Alpha running off to explore with his mini Omega after being freed and gaining a soul, which now we can only communicate with him because of the Echo, which confirms that he has a soul. I thought that was a nice touch. And it was actually really sad to see our buddy boy go off. I know that he needs this and he needs to do this, but it was still a little sad. And we see that the Omega weapon just disappears into Aether after us finally beating him in his final form, with him almost having a realization of, maybe I went about this the wrong way. The Omega series does a really amazing job of not only giving us a great story, but the encounters are its best feature. Oh my goodness, the encounters! So going into this raid, I was expecting some crazy stuff, but what I did not expect were how wild the encounters were going to be. Oh boy, they stepped up the difficulty. Omega challenges us to become the best test subjects that we can by fighting the very real iterations of creatures and lore and people from Eorzea's history. Given that he is a computer system, he can't really differentiate between fact and fiction. So he is literally taking legends and scaling them in their appropriate difficulty to face us. That is what's wild. This leads to, of course, some great callbacks to like Final Fantasy VI and beyond. Specifically one boss that I have to speak on immediately, which I really love, which was Kefka. This evil clown, who was not only accompanied by his monstrous pillar behind him, occasionally hits us with blasts and other mechanics, but these mechanics have a chance to be the opposite of what you would expect. As they are coming out, there could be question marks that pop up. And if that is the case, you were supposed to do the opposite of what you were supposed to do. So yes, you do get to stand in the fire, Black Mage, don't worry, your cast will get off. But something interesting, and this isn't just with Kefka alone, this carries over to the other bosses in the Omega raids, is that they aren't instant pushovers. Now, granted, I ran these on mine, and I even had Galactic running around in the back to kind of like cheer me on, so I get to really get the full experience of the mechanics, despite that we were literally fighting a boss for like 10 minutes. Holy crap, I love that. It really brought me back to some of the initial progressions that I did with World of Warcraft. Those days where the boss fights were not super easy and required a lot of coordination and pinpoint precision with DPS and positioning. It was almost like a nostalgic moment. And not to mention that bigger bosses appear in their own iterations, like Midgard Sormer, who is our friend, but we have to fight a shade or an echo of him or an iteration of him, and oh my god, I love the boss. He does like these huge room-filling attacks, but they're not easily predicted, and you can't really react to it. You have to watch how he spins and how he moves as they offer different variations for his attack. Sometimes they're wide circles, sometimes they're very narrow circles. Occasionally you have to run to the corners, other times you have to run in. I mean, it was incredibly well designed, and it was something that had me excited as I am progressing to each boss as I go forward. Even the final boss against Omega's human form really provided with some unique mechanics, and almost like a balancing of act between the two Omega forms that he had. And once we actually got to that point, the story is actually a little bit more somber and sad as a setting, just because it's like Omega is basically fighting to his last to figure out us. Like, how can he account for this variable that can't be accounted for? Regardless, I was thoroughly impressed with how well the mechanics in Omega improved my opinion on the raiding culture in Final Fantasy XIV. I was told many a time that the difficulty increased, and I was not disappointed in the least. This doesn't even include the savages that I was able to get into doing for Omega. Now, granted, these were not synced, and my team were, for the most part, able to blast through them. But really, what made them interesting is that they almost had like their own secret transition phase where the boss would go from its standard abilities into a brand new form with mechanics and everything. Like Exdeath going into Neo Exdeath and literally punching through the reality barrier ready to throw hands with us. That was wild. Or even Kefka. I mentioned Kefka, who turned into Holy Kefka, as he did in Final Fantasy VI. I mean, I could only imagine what it would be like to progress on the synced Savage difficulty, and it would just be so wild. I've continued to like the iterations of Savages being a step up in difficulty for raiding, because it really offers a little bit more variety in the end game for the raider. Sure, you could get through most of the Savages in Dawn Trail, but there are still tons of extremes that can be done, tons of Savage raids that are available for you to really bump up the difficulty and try your skill at. It's really a nice touch for those who are intrepid enough to enjoy it. Now, I think that I will probably come back to the Savages in either Alexander or Omega sometime, maybe perhaps once I catch up on current content, but that is something that I'd like to try out at least. Now, I am just simply progressing through the story, and I still have been told that the best is yet to come. However, in my experience here with these thus far, it has only really set my hopes and expectations for the combat difficulty, the encounter difficulty, super high, moving into Shadowbringers and Endwalker. Now, I do want to touch really quickly on how the Omega raids really scaled compared to, say, like Heavensward. Now, the Omega raids really gave me an eye-opening appeal about how the difficulty can be increased without really making it super repetitive or even unfair. Now, when I look at like the previous expansion in Heavensward, I know that the combat was intense, sure. However, it felt like it was a lot slower paced and a lot easier to deal with as compared to Stormblood encounters and then even the Omega raid. I mean, even look at like normal Alexander in its elements, as it has its fight difficulty, which is fairly difficult. However, it does become kind of fairly predictable, honestly, and they offered a lot of large windows to just simply DPS the boss and go crazy. Or even if we look at like King Thornton fight, which it all seemed fairly straightforward. I mean, the fights in Stormblood really added another layer of, holy crap, I have large AoEs that I need to manage and avoid, all the while I have a bomb mechanic on me that I need to make sure that I'm spread out far enough that I don't delete myself or other team members. I mean, there were a couple of times I had no idea how I died. Obviously, it's because I messed up a mechanic somewhere, but still, the learning curve was significantly harder here. And I mean, if we have like an apples to apples comparison of the Shinryu trial to King Thornton, it was significantly more challenging in my mind, like no contest. It was brutal, like the falling platform in phase 2 of the Shinryu fight, or the real-time action event, which if you messed up, you died. Like it was so cool. When I look at King Thornton in comparison, and I'm like, huh, that was actually kind of easy. I mean, I can really see why everyone said it only goes up from here as I have progressed through the game. And it really just has me excited for the new trials and the raids that I'll be able to progress through as I'm continuing my journey through Final Fantasy XIV. What are your thoughts on Omega? Tell me down in the comment section below. If you want to see my final verdict on the base Stormblood expansion, you can click this video here. Otherwise, stay caffeinated, folks.